They were just a few steps away when the gasp broke the silence. Dan Cathy stood in the doorway of his mansion, briefcase limp in his hand, eyes frozen on what should have been impossible. 3 toddlers, walking. Oscar, Oliver, and Ozzy, his sons, were toddling across the polished floor, their arms stretched forward, their mouths open with sounds he'd never heard them make. "They're walking," he whispered, the words barely escaping. Across the room, Lucy knelt on the floor, arms wide, tears glistening in her eyes. "And talking," she said, voice catching. "They just called me Mama." Dan didn't move. Couldn't. For nearly 2 years, his boys hadn't spoken a single word, hadn't taken a single step. The specialists said they might never. He gave them everything: technology, security, the best minds money could buy. But this miracle hadn't come from a program or a protocol. It came from the woman kneeling before them, Lucy Davies, the maid. To understand how we got here, to this moment of grace, defiance, and quiet revolution, we have to go back. To the silence, to the grief, to a house ruled by systems and sorrow. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we almost never hear. Dan Cathy had walked into many rooms in his life, boardrooms, conference halls, private jets, but nothing ever stopped him cold like this. The living room he'd designed with expert architects now felt unfamiliar, because for the first time it was alive. 3 small boys in matching blue onesies took shaky, determined steps across the polished floor. They didn't look at him. They looked at her. Lucy knelt at their level, smiling through tears, her arms open, her voice gentle, not commanding, not coaching, just waiting. Oscar squealed and reached her first. Oliver fell and laughed. Ozzy called out, "Mama," without hesitation. Dan's knees buckled. His briefcase slipped from his hand, hitting the marble with a heavy thud. They had never walked, never spoken, not once. Now they moved like they'd known how all along, like something had simply unlocked. Lucy looked up at him, lips trembling. She didn't apologize. She didn't speak. And for the first time in years, Dan didn't ask for data, or explanation, or control. He just watched. A man who'd built empires, undone by 3 tiny footsteps. But miracles don't start in moments like this. They're born in the dark, in silence, long before anyone sees the light. Let's go back to where it all began. The Cathy estate was everything headlines praised. 40,000 square feet of polished marble, sculpted gardens, and AI-powered everything. But no one ever wrote about the stillness. Not the way footsteps echoed like ghosts down the halls. Not the way laughter never lived here. Dan had built it all, after losing Caroline, his wife, during childbirth. He buried his grief in progress, in code, in capital, in calendars booked 6 months out. He was a billionaire. But when it came to fatherhood, he disappeared. Oscar, Oliver, Ozzy. His sons had never walked, never spoken, never reached for him. Specialists were hired. Therapists cycled through. Schedules were printed and pinned to every wall. Still, nothing. The boys sat where they were placed, quiet, blank, as if the world hadn't finished downloading into them. Caretakers came and went, each one promising breakthroughs. None stayed. Behind every door, the same rhythm, soft beeping from baby monitors, muted sobs from somewhere behind a wall, and silence where there should have been life. Dan wasn't cruel, he was controlled, efficient. He believed systems could solve anything, but love isn't a system, and grief doesn't keep a schedule. And into this cold machine came someone warm. Lucy Davies was raised on porches and prayer. South Carolina summers, the smell of cornbread and old pine. A home held together by her grandmother's hands, and a kind of love that didn't quit even when life did. She'd known loss early, her own mother gone before she could form the word. But what her life lacked in structure, it made up for in soul. By 26, Lucy had cared for more children than most people meet in a lifetime. Not in labs, not in clinics, but on knees in kitchens at story time. She never earned a formal degree, but she'd studied faces, quiet ones, hurting ones, until she could hear what they weren't saying, especially the ones too small to speak. So when she saw the job listing, something caught. Not the salary, not the mansion, the photo. 3 boys, same eyes, same silence. She knew that silence. She'd lived inside it. At the interview, Dan never looked up from his tablet. He asked no questions about her instincts, only procedures, clean schedules, quiet hands, no deviations. Lucy didn't flinch. She nodded, listened, waited. But inside, she'd already made her decision. She wasn't walking into a job. She was walking toward 3 little boys she hadn't met, but somehow already knew. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't here to follow rules. She was here to reach them. In the Cathy household, everything had a protocol. Wake times, nap times, feeding windows, toy rotations, each moment calculated, logged, reviewed. Lucy received a binder on her first day, color-coded tabs, biometric data, feeding charts. There were cameras in every room. The boys' milestones, missed or met, were monitored like market trends. But nowhere in those pages was there space for touch. No column for lullabies, no box to check for trust. Dan believed systems kept things safe, safe from chaos, safe from hurt. Lucy didn't argue. She followed the rules at first, but when no one watched, she did something radical. She sang, softly under her breath, while folding laundry near their cribs. She brushed fingers through tangled curls. She spoke to them not as clients, but as children, and something began to shift. Not big things, not yet. A glance that lingered longer, a hand that reached back. A half smile curled beneath a pacifier. The triplets didn't speak, they didn't walk. But they noticed her, and she saw it. Dan, from his office, watched clips of her care like security footage, an observer behind glass. He made no comment, issued no praise, only silence. But Lucy, she noticed everything, and she began to write it down. In a weathered notebook she kept tucked in her bag, she recorded each flicker of light in their eyes, each moment that proved they were still in there, waiting. The system ran the house, but it was Lucy's soul that filled the room. The rule was unspoken, but understood. The boys stayed inside. Too many risks, too many variables, too much that couldn't be controlled. But one morning, Lucy made a choice. She slipped off their socks, carried them, one by one, into the backyard, set them down barefoot. The sun warmed their faces, green grass. The breeze brushed their hair. And Lucy just sat with them. No toys, no tests, just time. She spoke to them like they understood, because in her heart she believed they did. Oscar blinked up at the sky. Oliver leaned into her shoulder. Ozzy reached for a butterflies and laughed. Babble came next, loose sounds, bubbling like springs. Then fingers stretched toward blades of grass. Then to each other, a shared glance, a mirrored grin. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden, but something was waking up. Later that night, Lucy wept quietly in the laundry room, not because she was sad, but because she knew. Something was changing, and it wasn't a fluke. The other staff began to whisper. The boys were different now, more present, more aware. Dan's assistant brought it up once in passing. "They're responding to her," she said. Dan shrugged, called it coincidence, a phase, maybe a growth spurt. He didn't ask for details, didn't watch the footage, didn't see Oscar reach for Lucy's hand and hold it tight. Lucy wasn't trying to fix them, she was trying to free them. Dan hadn't planned to come home early, but when he stepped into the nursery, what he saw stopped him. Lucy sat on the rug, legs folded, a book half open in her lap. All 3 boys were draped across her chest, sleeping, breathing in sync, arms curled against her like roots around home. No cribs, no boundaries, no schedule, just warmth and rest. Dan's voice cut through it like glass. "This is not how we do things here." Lucy looked up, unflinching. "I know," she said softly. "But it's how they need things." He bristled, launched into policies, risk factors, professional distance. But Lucy didn't flinch, not this time. "They need to feel safe," she said, "not just managed, loved, held, touched." Her voice didn't waver. "You hired caretakers to do everything but care." For a moment, Dan stood frozen. Then he turned and left without another word. That night, the house felt colder than usual. Dan poured bourbon in Caroline's old study, sat in the dark, surrounded by the smell of her, lavender and ink and loss. On a whim, he opened the surveillance app and watched. Lucy humming softly, a child on each side, one hand rubbing a back, one brushing hair behind a tiny ear, not trained, not efficient, but real. Dan didn't speak, didn't blink, but somewhere behind his ribs, something shifted. A crack, a thaw, a sound he hadn't heard in years, longing. He still couldn't say the words, but he'd seen the truth. The bath had become their favorite part of the day. Warm water, floating toys, Lucy's gentle voice echoing off tiled walls. That evening, she was making bubble crowns when it happened. Ozzy paused, looked right at her, then softly said, "Baba." Lucy froze. So did his brothers. 3 sets of eyes, wide as moons. Then, Oliver repeated it. "Ba, ba." Lucy let out a sound, half laugh, half sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision as she pulled them close, whispering, "That's right, baby, that's your voice." The next morning, Oscar did something no one expected. He took one wobbly step, just one, toward a plush giraffe on the nursery floor. Lucy reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over Dan's contact. She dialed. Voicemail. "Mr. Cathy is in a board meeting," the assistant said. Lucy didn't leave a message. She hung up and watched the boys instead. Each day the changes came faster. A hand reaching, a sound forming, a laugh shared. They were blooming. But Lucy kept it quiet. No updates, no reports, no fanfare. She didn't want Dan to read about it in a memo. She wanted him to see it, not data, to feel what she felt. The boys were waking up, not from sleep, but from silence. And Lucy knew. The next time Dan saw them, everything would change. It was just another rainy afternoon. Grey skies, soft light, no agenda. Lucy sat cross-legged on the playroom floor, her voice a thread in the hush. The boys crawled toward her, clumsy and curious. Then, something shifted. Oscar pushed himself up on trembling legs, wobbled, paused. Lucy didn't reach. She didn't cheer. She waited. Oliver followed. Then Ozzy. All 3 boys, unsteady, unsure, found their balance. And then, they moved. Tiny feet pattered across the rug, first toward Lucy, then toward each other, stumbling, grinning, glowing. She opened her arms wide, silent invitation. They ran into her lap like they'd been doing it all along. She kissed their heads, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. They were walking. And then the door opened. Dan stood there, briefcase in hand, shoes wet from the rain, frozen in place, his jaw slack, his world unraveling. Oscar turned, pointed. "Mama!" Oliver joined. "Mama!" Ozzy giggled. "Up, Mama!" Dan's breath caught in his throat. They weren't looking at him, they were looking at her. Lucy, kneeling on the rug, arms full of boys who had once been silent shadows. Time held its breath. Dan didn't speak, didn't move, couldn't. Everything he thought he understood about healing, about growth, about possibility, it all fell away. They walked, they spoke, they chose her. But what broke Dan wasn't just the miracle. It was what it meant. Dan couldn't move. Grief, guilt, years of distance, everything he'd buried beneath work and wealth, rose all at once and crashed into him like a wave. Lucy stood, heart pounding, boys still clinging to her. "I didn't mean to," she began. But Dan dropped the briefcase, then dropped to his knees. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Thank you." Lucy hesitated, then stepped back, and let the boys choose. They did. Tiny arms reached for him. No fear, no flinching, just trust. He held them, really held them, for the first time in what felt like forever. His shoulders shook, his tears were silent, and the boys laughed. The cameras came down 3 days later. The schedules disappeared. The silence that once haunted the house was replaced by something louder, life. Blocks clattered, lullabies played, crayons rolled off tabletops. Dan stayed home. He learned how to hold them, how to soothe them, how to see them. One night, he sat beside Lucy on the nursery floor as she read aloud. All 3 boys leaned into her, sleepy and safe. She turned the page. He didn't look at the book. He looked at them, then at her. Not the maid, not the miracle. Family. They needed love. That's all. Just love.